I sat in that cold car for 2 hours on Christmas Eve, watching through the window as my son's family celebrated without me. The same son I raised alone after his mother left. The same boy I worked 3 jobs for, put through college, and stood by through every mistake. But somehow, I wasn't good enough for their Christmas table. At 67 years old, I learned that being a father means nothing when your child decides you're disposable. If you've ever felt something similar, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. I was sitting in my small living room on December 22nd, looking at the stack of wrapped presents I'd arranged so carefully on my coffee table. 3 gifts for my grandson Tommy, 2 for little Emma. I'd spent weeks researching what 7- and 5-year-olds wanted for Christmas these days. The toy store clerk probably thought I was crazy, standing in those aisles for an hour, reading every box, making sure I got it exactly right. The apartment was quiet except for the hum of my old refrigerator. At 67, you learn to appreciate quiet, but this felt different. Heavy, like the calm before something breaks. When my phone rang, I smiled. Michael's name on the caller ID always made me smile back then. "Hey, Dad." His voice sounded strange right away, distant, not the warm tone I was used to. "Michael," I muted the television. "How are you, son? How are the kids?" "They're good, Dad. Listen, I need to talk to you about Christmas." I leaned forward in my chair, already sensing something was wrong. "What about it?" There was this pause. Too long, the kind of pause that tells you your world is about to shift. "There's been a change of plans." 4 words, such simple words, but they hit me like a physical blow to the chest. "What kind of change?" I kept my voice steady, but my hands were already shaking. "Sarah thinks, well, we both think it might be less stress. Full if you didn't join us this year. Less stressful." I stared at those wrapped presents on my table, and for a moment I couldn't breathe. "Less stressful how, Michael?" "You know how it is, Dad. The kids get overwhelmed with too many people around." But I did know how it was. I knew that last Christmas, Sarah's entire family had been there. Her parents, her sister and brother-in-law, their 3 kids, her aunt and uncle. 15 people crammed around that dining room table, voices overlapping, children running everywhere, and nobody mentioned being overwhelmed then. Have I done something wrong? The words came out smaller than I intended. Another pause. This one even longer. "It's not about you, Dad." But we both knew it was. Everything about his tone, about this call, about the fact that he was uninviting his own father from Christmas dinner 3 days before Christmas. It was all about me. I see. I looked down at my hands. When had they gotten so old? When had the veins become so prominent, the skin so thin? When did you decide this? It's not... Dad, please don't make this harder than it has to be. Harder than it has to be, as if I was the one making it hard. As if I was the one choosing to shatter 30 years of Christmas traditions with a phone call. "What about the presents?" I asked, because I didn't know what else to say. "You can drop them off sometime. Maybe the weekend after." Drop them off, like a delivery man, like someone who didn't belong inside the house where my grandchildren lived. If you've ever felt the ground disappear beneath your feet while you're still standing on it, you know what I felt in that moment. If you've ever been made to feel invisible by the people who should see you most clearly, then you understand. And if this story sounds familiar, if you've lived something like it yourself, please don't forget to like this video, subscribe, and share your own story in the comments below. "I understand," I said, though I didn't understand anything at all. "Thanks, Dad. I knew you'd understand." But I didn't understand. I didn't understand how the man I'd raised alone from the age of 6, the boy I'd worked 3 jobs to support, the son I'd put through college with loans I was still paying off at 67 years old, could call me 3 days before Christmas and tell me I wasn't welcome at his table. "Have a good Christmas, Michael." "You too, Dad. I'll call you next week." The line went dead, and I sat there holding the phone long after the dial tone started. The wrapped presents seemed to mock me from the coffee table. All that time I'd spent choosing them, all that excitement I'd felt imagining the children's faces when they opened them. I set the phone down and looked around my apartment. It felt smaller suddenly, quieter. The walls seemed closer together, like they were closing in. I got up and walked to the kitchen, poured myself a glass of water I didn't want, and tried to make sense of what had just happened. Less stressful. The phrase kept echoing in my head. When had I become stressful? When had my presence at family gatherings become a burden instead of a joy? I thought about the last few times I'd been to Michael and Sarah's house. Had I said something wrong? Done something inappropriate? I replayed every conversation, every interaction, searching for the moment when I'd crossed some invisible line. Was it when I brought store-bought cookies to Emma's birthday party instead of homemade ones? Sarah had made a comment about how homemade treats mean so much more to children, and I'd felt embarrassed, inadequate. I'd wanted to explain that after working a 10-hour shift at the hardware store, I didn't have the energy to bake, but I'd kept quiet. Was it when I fell asleep during Emma's piano recital last month? I'd worked a double shift the night before, the store was short-staffed, and I needed the overtime pay. But sitting in that warm auditorium, listening to 25-year-olds play Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star, my eyes had gotten heavy. I'd woken up when the applause started, hoping no one noticed. But Sarah had noticed. I saw her whisper something to Michael, saw the look they exchanged. Maybe it was the way I dressed. My best clothes weren't quite nice enough for their crowd anymore. Michael had done well for himself, married into a family with money, built a life I could never afford. Maybe my presence reminded them of where he'd come from, and they'd decided that wasn't the image they wanted at their Christmas table. Or maybe it was simpler than that. Maybe I'd just gotten old, and old people are inconvenient. We move slower, we repeat stories, we don't hear everything the first time. Maybe I'd become the relative people tolerate out of obligation, and Sarah had finally convinced Michael that even obligation had its limits. I walked back to the living room and sat down in my chair, staring at those presents again. Tommy's remote control car, the one he'd circled in 3 different catalogs, Emma's art set, with every color crayon imaginable, the book about dinosaurs I'd found because Michael mentioned she was going through a prehistoric phase. Now I didn't even know when I'd be able to give them these gifts. Drop them off sometime, Michael had said, like I was Amazon delivering a package. The silence in my apartment grew heavier. Outside I could hear cars driving by, people heading home to their families, to their Christmas preparations. Inside there was just me and the weight of being unwanted. I thought about calling Michael back, demanding a better explanation, refusing to accept this exile without a fight. But what would be the point? You can't argue your way back into someone's love. You can't force someone to want you at their table. The truth settled over me like a cold blanket. My son didn't want me at Christmas anymore. The boy I'd raised, the man I'd sacrificed everything for, had decided I was too much trouble, too stressful, too embarrassing to include in his new life. And the worst part was that deep down, in a place I didn't want to acknowledge, I wondered if he might be right. The morning after that phone call, I couldn't sleep past 5:30. I made coffee in the dark and sat at my kitchen table trying to understand when everything changed. When did I stop being dad and become someone who causes stress just by existing? I kept going back to when Michael was 8 years old. Back then, I was his hero. I was the man who could fix any broken toy with a screwdriver and some patience. I was the dad who taught him to ride his bike in that empty parking lot behind our old apartment building, running alongside him until he found his balance, cheering when he finally rode those wobbly circles all by himself. "I did it, Dad! Did you see me? I did it!" His voice was so full of joy that day, pure, uncomplicated joy. And I was the reason for it. Those were the days when Michael's problems had simple solutions. A scraped knee needed a Band-Aid and a hug. A nightmare meant climbing into bed with Dad until the monsters went away. A broken toy just needed the right tool and some time. I wish I could say his mother left us gradually, but that's not how it happened. Janet packed her things on a Tuesday morning in March while Michael was at school and I was at work. I came home to find half our belongings gone and a note on the kitchen counter. "I can't do this anymore, I'm sorry." That was it. 6 words to end 8 years of marriage, to abandon the child we'd made together. Michael cried for her every night for months. He'd stand at his bedroom window watching for her car to pull into the driveway. He'd ask me every morning if today was the day Mommy was coming home. "I don't know, buddy." "Yes, sure," I'd tell him, because I didn't want to lie. But I also couldn't bear to tell a 6-year-old that his mother might never come back. I never spoke badly about Janet to Michael. Not once. Even when he sobbed himself to sleep calling for her. Even when I had to explain to his teacher why he was so distracted in class. Even when other parents at school events looked at me with that mixture of pity and judgment reserved for single fathers. I became mother and father both. I learned to braid hair by watching YouTube videos the night before school picture day, my big clumsy fingers working through Michael's fine brown hair until it looked somewhat decent. I figured out how to help with math homework, subjects I'd forgotten decades ago, staying up after Michael went to bed to teach myself fractions and long division all over again. I worked 3 jobs just to keep us afloat. Morning shift at the factory from 6 to 2, evenings at the gas station from 4 to 10, weekends doing landscaping for a company that paid cash and didn't ask too many questions about my availability. Michael never knew how close we came to losing everything. He never knew that I ate peanut butter sandwiches for dinner most nights so there would be enough money for his school supplies and decent clothes. He never knew that I sometimes sat in my car after my night shift, too tired to walk up the stairs to our apartment, falling asleep behind the wheel in our own parking lot. But he also never went without. That was the promise I made to myself when Janet left. Michael would never suffer because of his mother's choice to abandon us. When he got accepted to State University, I cried in the financial aid office. Right there in front of the counselor, tears running down my face like I was the 18-year-old heading to college instead of the 45-year-old father who'd made it possible. I took out loans I'm still paying off at 67, Parent Plus loans with interest rates that would make you sick. But seeing Michael walk across that graduation stage in his cap and gown, hearing them call his name, watching him shake the dean's hand, it made every sacrifice worth it, or so I thought. Now I sit here wondering when gratitude became obligation. When did obligation become resentment? Michael met Sarah during his senior year. I liked her at first. I really did. She was smart, ambitious, came from a good family. She seemed to make Michael happy, and that was all I cared about. She laughed at his jokes, encouraged his dreams, supported his decision to go to graduate school. At their wedding, I gave a toast about how proud I was of the man Michael had become. I talked about watching him grow from that scared little boy missing his mother into this confident young man ready to build his own family. Sarah, I said, raising my glass, thank you for loving my son. Thank you for seeing in him what I've always seen. Sarah smiled and raised her glass back to me. Michael hugged me afterward, told me it was the perfect toast. But gradually things began to change. Family dinners became less frequent. At first, it was understandable. They were busy with graduate school, then with new jobs, then with wedding planning. But even after they got married, even after they settled into their routine, the invitations came less often. Phone calls got shorter too. What used to be hour-long conversations about everything and nothing became quick check-ins. How are you, Dad? I'm good, son. How's work? How's Sarah? Good, everything's good. Listen, I can't talk long, but I wanted to see how you're doing. 10 minutes, maybe 15 if I was lucky. Then he'd have to go, dinner to cook, errands to run, a life that was too full to include much of his father. When they had children, I thought things would get better. Surely grandchildren would bring us closer together. Surely becoming a father himself would help Michael understand what I'd gone through raising him alone. Instead, I became the grandfather who had to ask permission to see his own grandkids. Dad, this weekend isn't good. Tommy has soccer and Emma has a birthday party. What about next weekend? Let me check with Sarah and get back to you. I was given scheduled time slots like a dentist appointment, 2 hours on Sunday afternoon, 1 evening during the week if they weren't too busy, always with advance notice required, always subject to cancellation if something more important came up. And there was always something more important. I started to notice how different things were when Sarah's parents visited. They came and went as they pleased. They had keys to the house. They were expected at birthday parties and school events. They were family in a way that I, somehow, was not. Bob and Linda lived 3 hours away, but they saw the grandchildren more often than I did, and I lived 20 minutes from Michael's house. It's different with Sarah's parents, Michael explained once when I asked about it. They just show up, you know. They don't need an invitation. But I did need an invitation. I needed permission. I needed to be convenient, to fit into their schedule, to not cause any stress or disruption to their carefully organized life. I started to understand that I was being managed, not welcomed, not embraced, managed, like a responsibility that had to be handled rather than a relationship to be cherished. The worst part was how gradual it all was. If Michael had suddenly stopped talking to me, if he'd had some dramatic confrontation and cut me out of his life completely, at least I would have known what I was dealing with. But this slow fade, this gentle but steady erosion of my place in his world was harder to fight because it was harder to define. What do you say? Son, you don't call me enough? Son, you don't invite me over as much as you used to? It sounds petty, needy, like the complaints of a lonely old man who doesn't understand that people get busy. But I wasn't asking for much. I wasn't asking to move in with them or to be involved in every decision. I just wanted to be wanted. I wanted to feel like I mattered to the son I'd raised, to the grandchildren who barely knew me. I wanted to be more than an obligation to be managed. Sitting there at my kitchen table that morning, watching the sun come up over a world that felt smaller than it used to, I realized that somewhere along the way, I'd become the problem that needed to be solved rather than the father who deserved to be loved. And the most painful part of all was that I couldn't pinpoint exactly when it happened. It was like watching a plant die. You don't notice it day by day, but one morning you wake up and realize that what used to be alive and growing has withered away while you weren't paying attention. Maybe that's what happened to my relationship with Michael. It died so slowly, so quietly, that by the time I noticed, it was already too late to save it. Christmas Eve arrived gray and cold, the kind of December day that makes you want to stay inside with a cup of coffee and pretend the world doesn't exist. But I couldn't sit still. Those wrapped presents on my coffee table seemed to stare at me, reminding me that somewhere across town my grandchildren were getting ready for Christmas morning, and I wouldn't be there to see it. I told myself I was just going to drive by Michael's house, maybe drop off the presents at the door, ring the bell quickly, wish everyone Merry Christmas, and leave. I wasn't trying to force my way into their celebration. I just wanted to see my grandchildren's faces when they got their gifts. Was that too much to ask? The drive to Michael's neighborhood took 15 minutes, but I stretched it to 30, taking the long way, stopping at red lights longer than necessary. Part of me hoped I'd change my mind, turn around, go home. But a bigger part of me needed to see the house where my family was gathering without me. Michael and Sarah lived in one of those suburban developments where every house looks almost identical, but costs more than I'll make in 3 years. Perfect lawns, perfect driveways, perfect lives behind perfect windows. I parked across the street, under a bare oak tree that gave me some cover. The house looked beautiful. Sarah had always been good at decorating. White lights outlined the windows and door frame. A wreath hung on the front door. Through the living room window, I could see their Christmas tree, tall and full, covered in what looked like expensive ornaments. I sat there for maybe 10 minutes, working up the courage to walk to the door, when Sarah's parents' car pulled into the driveway. Bob and Linda climbed out, their arms full of presents and covered dishes. Even from across the street I could hear Linda's laughter as she balanced a casserole dish on her hip while Bob grabbed more packages from the back seat. The front door opened before they even reached it, and there was Michael smiling, helping them with their load. "Merry Christmas!" I could hear him call out, his voice carrying in the cold air. They disappeared inside, and I watched through the windows as people moved around, embracing, settling into what looked like easy, comfortable conversation. 20 minutes later, another car pulled up. Sarah's sister Janet and her family. 3 kids jumped out of the back seat, running toward the house like they owned it. Which, in a way, I suppose they did. They belonged there, in a way I apparently didn't. I counted the people as they arrived. Sarah's parents. Titi's, her sister's family of 5. That was 7 people plus Michael, Sarah, and their 2 children, 11 people total. This was the gathering I was told would be too stressful, too overwhelming. The warm yellow light spilled from the windows, and I could see silhouettes of people hugging, laughing, moving around the kitchen. Children's voices carried faintly through the glass. I watched a little boy, probably Janet's youngest, run through the living room chasing what looked like a dog I didn't even know they had. This wasn't too many people. This was exactly the right number of people. It was just that I wasn't one of them. The realization hit me like a physical blow to the chest. I wasn't too much for the celebration. I was just not wanted in it. I should have started the car and driven away. Any reasonable person would have left, but I couldn't make myself turn the key. I kept thinking that any minute now, Michael would look out the window, see me sitting here, and realize what a terrible mistake this was. Maybe he'd come running out, apologizing, explaining that it had all been a misunderstanding. Maybe Sarah would see me and remember that I was Tommy and Emma's grandfather, that I belonged at this table as much as anyone. But minutes turned into an hour, and no one came. I watched my son's life happening without me. Through those lit windows, I could see fragments of the celebration I was missing. Someone carrying a tray from the kitchen to the dining room. A child running past a window. Sarah gesturing with her hands as she told what looked like a story that made everyone laugh. This was my family, and I was watching it like a stranger, like someone passing by on the street. catching glimpses of other people's happiness. For the first time in my life, I truly understood what it meant to be erased from your own family. Not cut out dramatically, not after some big fight or confrontation, but simply erased, made invisible, written out of the story as if I'd never been part of it at all. The cold started seeping into the car, but I realized I was shivering for reasons that had nothing to do with the temperature. I was shivering from loneliness, from the crushing weight of being invisible to the people who should love you most. If you've ever felt completely alone while surrounded by people you love, you know this feeling. If you've ever realized that you matter less than you thought you did, that your presence is optional in the lives of people you'd die for, then you understand what I felt sitting in that car. And if this story resonates with you, if you've lived something like this yourself, please take a moment to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your own experiences in the comments. Sometimes the most healing thing we can do is realize we're not alone in our pain. Around 7 o'clock, I saw them moving toward the dining room. Through the window, I could see the table Sarah had set. It looked perfect, like something from a magazine. Candles, cloth napkins, what appeared to be her grandmother's china. The kind of formal, beautiful Christmas dinner I'd never been able to give Michael when he was growing up. I watched them take their seats. Bob at one end, Michael at the other. Sarah next to her mother, the children scattered between the adults. A full table, a complete family. A family that didn't include me. When Michael stood up to carve the turkey, I could see he was wearing the red sweater I'd bought him last Christmas, the one I'd found on sale at Macy's, marked down from $80 to $30. I'd been so proud of finding it, thought it would be perfect for him. He'd kept the sweater, but he'd thrown away the man who gave it to him. That small detail broke something inside me. He was wearing my gift while celebrating Christmas without me. Using something I'd chosen for him, something I'd been excited to see him open, while I sat in a cold car across the street like some kind of unwanted stranger. Through the window I watched Michael lift Emma onto his shoulders, spinning her around while she giggled, with joy. Instead, it made me remember doing the same thing with Michael when he was that age, lifting him up, spinning him until we were both dizzy, listening to his delighted squeals. "Higher, Daddy, higher!" I'd been the center of his world then, the person he ran to when he was scared, when he was hurt, when he was happy and wanted to share his joy. I'd been his hero, his protector, his whole world. Now I was the person who caused stress just by existing. The memory of young Michael on my shoulders while I watched grown Michael with his own daughter made the present moment unbearable. I was watching the father I'd raised, seeing him be the kind of dad I'd tried to be, and realizing that somehow, somewhere along the way, he'd decided I wasn't good enough to be part of this picture anymore. A police car turned onto the street, driving slowly, and I suddenly understood how this must look. An old man sitting alone in a car, watching a house full of people celebrating. If the officer looked closely, he might see something suspicious, a potential threat. I should have been embarrassed. Should have started the car and driven away before someone called about the creepy old man stalking the Christmas party. But I was too tired to care what anyone thought anymore. Too tired to be embarrassed about wanting to be part of my own family's life. The silence inside that car was the loudest sound I'd ever heard. It was the silence of being forgotten. The silence of not mattering anymore. The silence of watching your own son live his life as if you'd never been part of it at all. And in that silence, I finally understood what this was really about. It wasn't that I'd done something wrong, said something inappropriate, or failed to meet some standard I didn't understand. It was simpler than that, and somehow more painful. I just wasn't wanted anymore. 2 hours had passed, and I was still sitting in that car like some kind of pathetic stalker. My hands had gone numb from the cold, my back ached from the uncomfortable position, but I couldn't bring myself to put the key in the ignition and drive away. It was as if leaving would make this rejection final, real. As long as I stayed here, there was still a chance this nightmare could end. Maybe someone would look out and see me. Maybe they'd realize how cruel this was and invite me in. But deep down, I knew better. I knew I was torturing myself, prolonging a pain that was only going to get worse. Still, I couldn't leave. Not yet. Through the dining room windows, I could see them settling in for dinner. The scene looked like a Norman Rockwell painting, the perfect American family gathered around a perfectly set table. Sarah had outdone herself with the decorations. Candles flickered between arrangements of pine branches and red berries. The good china caught the light from the chandelier overhead. Sarah always was good at that kind of thing, making everything look beautiful, creating the kind of atmosphere that made ordinary moments feel special. It was one of the things I'd liked about her when Michael first brought her home. The table was full of people, full of life, full of everything a Christmas dinner should be. Everything except me. I could see Michael at the head of the table, carving what looked like a perfect golden turkey. His movements were confident, practiced. When had he learned to carve a turkey? I'd never taught him that. We'd never owned a turkey big enough for carving when he was growing up. He was wearing that red sweater I'd bought him last Christmas. The sight of it was like a knife twisting in my chest. He'd kept the gift but discarded the giver. He was wrapping himself in my love while shutting me out of his life. I thought about all the Christmas dinners I'd hosted when Meech Ale was growing up. How I'd save up for weeks just to afford a decent meal. We'd have a small ham instead of turkey. Turkey was too expensive, and besides, it was just the two of us. What would we have done with all those leftovers? We'd eat by candlelight, but not because it was romantic or festive. We'd eat by candlelight because the electricity had been shut off again, and I was too proud to tell Michael. I'd light candles and tell him we were having a special dinner, just like in fancy restaurants. "This is better than electricity, Dad," he'd said once, when he was maybe 9 years old. "Candles make everything look magical." I'd smiled and agreed, not telling him that the magic was really just poverty in disguise. Michael never knew about the nights I went to bed hungry, so there would be enough food for him the next day. He never knew about the extra shifts I picked up during the holidays so he could have name-brand gifts instead of generic ones. He never knew that I'd work overtime for months just to make sure Christmas morning felt special. Maybe that was my mistake. Maybe I protected him too well from our struggles. Maybe I should have let him see what sacrifice looked like, what it cost me to give him the childhood he deserved. Because now he was successful, comfortable, surrounded by abundance, and somehow I'd become the burden he needed to cut loose. Through the window I watched him laugh at something Sarah's father said. Bob was a good man, I had to admit. Retired from some corporate job, comfortable pension, the kind of father-in-law who could take the whole family on vacation without thinking twice about the cost. Bob had never had to choose between paying the electric bill and buying his kid new shoes. Bob had never fallen asleep at the kitchen table because he was working 3 jobs and getting 4 hours of sleep a night. Bob's love came without sacrifice, without struce, glow, without the messy complications of real hardship. Maybe that's what Michael wanted now. Clean, comfortable relationships that didn't remind him of where he came from. A father-in-law who belonged at investment seminars and country clubs. Not a father who still shopped with coupons and drove a car that was older than his grandchildren. I watched Sarah's sister Janet cutting food for her youngest child, wiping his face with a napkin, the casual intimacy of family dinners. Janet's husband was explaining something with animated gestures, making the whole table laugh. Even the children seemed perfectly at ease, like they'd been part of this family their whole lives. Which, I suppose, they had been. From the moment Michael married Sarah, her family had claimed him as their own, and he'd let them. He'd stepped into their world of comfortable abundance and left his old world, left me, behind. A police car turned down the street, moving slowly, and for a moment I panicked. This had to look suspicious. An old man sitting alone in a car, staring at a house full of people celebrating. If the officer looked closely, he might think I was casing the place, or worse. But the car passed by without stopping, and I realized I should be embarrassed, should be ashamed of myself for sitting here like this, watching my own family through windows like some kind of voyeur. But I wasn't embarrassed. I was too tired for embarrassment, too tired to care what anyone thought anymore. I was tired of being careful, of being grateful for scraps of attention, of pretending it was normal that I had to ask permission to see my own grandchildren. I was tired of being managed like a problem to be solved rather than loved like a father who'd earned his place at that table. The cold had settled deep into my bones, but I didn't start the car. Starting the car would mean admitting this was over. That I was really going to spend Christmas Eve alone in my apartment while my family celebrated without me. I pulled my coat tighter and kept watching, kept torturing myself with glimpses of the life I wasn't allowed to be part of anymore. Through the window I could see Tommy, my grandson, though he barely knew me, showing off something to his cousin, a new toy maybe, or a drawing he'd made, the kind of moment that grandparents are supposed to witness, supposed to be part of. Emma was sitting next to Sarah's mother, Linda, both of them looking at what appeared to be a picture book. Linda was pointing at something on the page, and Emma was nodding eagerly. It should have been me showing her that book, me answering her questions, me being part of her Christmas memories. But I was out here in the cold, watching someone else fill the space that should have been mine. The worst part wasn't the cold, or the discomfort, or even the loneliness. The worst part was the slow, terrible understanding that this wasn't temporary. This wasn't a misunderstanding that could be cleared up with a phone call or an apology. This was my new reality. This was how it was going to be from now on. I was the father who'd been written out of the story, the grandfather who'd been deemed unnecessary, the man who'd sacrificed everything to raise his son, only to discover that gratitude has an expiration date, and mine had run out. I finally forced myself to start the car at 9:30, when the last of the dinner dishes disappeared from view and the family moved back to the living room. My body ached from sitting in that cramped position for so long, and my hands were so numb I could barely grip the steering wheel. The drive home took me through empty streets decorated with Christmas lights. Every house seemed to glow with warmth and celebration. Families gathered in living rooms, children's faces pressed against windows, the soft light of Christmas trees visible through curtains left open to share the joy with the world. Everyone else was inside where it was warm, where they belonged. Only I was out here in the cold, driving home alone on Christmas Eve. As I made my way through the silent neighborhoods, memories started flooding back, uninvited and painful. I couldn't stop them from coming, couldn't push them away. They filled the quiet car like ghosts I'd tried to forget. I remembered Michael at 5 years old, insisting on helping me make Christmas dinner even though his help usually meant twice as much work for me. He'd drag his little step stool over to the stove, determined to stir everything whether it needed stirring or not. "I'm cooking, Dad. Look, I'm really cooking." His face would be so serious, so focused, like he was performing surgery instead of stirring mashed potatoes. He'd chatter constantly about Santa Claus and reindeer, and whether we'd been good enough boys to get the presents we wanted. "Dad, do you think Santa knows we don't have a fireplace?" he asked me one Christmas when he was maybe 6. I was trying to figure out how to make a Christmas ham with $2 left in my wallet, but I stopped everything to think about his question seriously. "Santa's magic, buddy," I told him. "He'll figure it out." What I didn't tell him was that I'd already figured it out. I'd stay up until 3 in the morning assembling toys and arranging presents under our small artificial tree, making sure that Christmas morning felt magical even if our bank account was empty. I'd eat the cookies he'd left for Santa, drink the milk, even leave a few crumbs on the plate to make it look real. I'd write "Thank you, Michael," in handwriting that looked different from mine, and sign it "Santa and the Reindeer." "He came, Dad! He really came!" Michael would scream Christmas morning, running to wake me up at dawn. "And he ate the cookies. Look, he wrote me a note." The joy on his face made every sacrifice worth it, every extra shift, every skipped meal, every night I fell asleep at the kitchen table because I was too tired to make it to bed. It was all worth it for those Christmas morning smiles. I remembered teaching him to drive in this same car I was sitting in now. He was 16 and terrified, convinced he was going to crash into everything. His hands gripped the steering wheel so tight his knuckles went white. "I can't do this, Dad. What if I hit something?" "You won't hit anything," I told him. "I'm right here. I won't let you crash." We spent hours in empty parking lots, going 5 miles an hour while he got used to the feel of the pedals, the weight of the steering wheel. When he finally managed to parallel park without hitting the curb, he whooped with excitement. "I did it! Dad, did you see that? I actually did it!" "I couldn't have done it without you, Dad," he said that day, and I believed him. I believed I mattered to him, that our bond was unbreakable, that no matter what happened in his life, he'd always need his old man around. When did that change? When did I stop being the dad he was proud of and become the dad he was ashamed of? Maybe it happened so gradually that neither of us noticed at first. Maybe it started when he went to college and discovered a world beyond our small apartment, beyond the second-hand furniture and generic groceries and careful budgeting that had defined his childhood. Maybe it was when he met Sarah and her family, saw how other people lived, how other fathers provided for their children without struggle, without sacrifice, without the constant worry about making ends meet. Maybe Sarah mentioned once or twice that I seemed tired, that I repeated stories, that I didn't quite fit in with their educated, successful crowd. Maybe she pointed out that I used the wrong fork at dinner parties, that I didn't know the difference between Cabernet and Merlot, that I couldn't contribute to conversations about stocks and real estate and European vacations. Maybe Michael started seeing me through her eyes instead of his own, instead of the father who'd given up everything for him. Maybe I became the embarrassing reminder of a past he'd rather forget. I thought about the last few family gatherings I'd been invited to, how I'd felt more and more like an outsider. Conversations would flow around me about investments and private schools and vacation destinations I could never afford. I'd sit quietly, nodding along, trying to look interested in topics I knew nothing about. Dad doesn't say much, I'd heard Sarah comment once to her sister. Not meanly, exactly, but with a kind of puzzled concern, like I was a problem that needed to be solved. What was I supposed to say? That I'd never had money to invest, never had the luxury of choosing between private schools, never been on a vacation that didn't involve visiting my cousin in the next state over? Maybe my silence made them uncomfortable. Maybe they decided it was easier to exclude me than to include someone who reminded them of a world they'd left behind. The traffic light ahead of me turned red, and I sat there in the empty intersection, remembering Michael's high school graduation. I'd been so proud, sitting in that auditorium in my one good suit, watching my boy walk across the stage to receive his diploma. He'd found me in the crowd afterward, his cap crooked, his grin wider than I'd ever seen it. "We did it, Dad, we actually did it." We did it. Not I did it, but we. Like he understood, even then, that his success was our success, that everything he'd accomplished had been a team effort. When had we become I? When had his achievements stopped being something we'd built together and started being something he'd done despite me? The light turned green, but I sat there for another moment, lost in the memory of that day, of how proud I'd been, how hopeful. I'd thought high school graduation was just the beginning, that college would make him even more grateful for everything we'd been through together. Instead, college had been the beginning of the end, the start of him building a life that didn't have room for the father who'd made it possible. Behind me, a car honked gently, reminding me that the light was green, that I needed to keep moving. I pressed the gas pedal and drove through the intersection, leaving that memory behind like everything else from those days when I still believed I mattered. By the time I pulled into my apartment complex parking lot, the memories had settled into a dull ache in my chest. I sat in the car for a few minutes, looking up at my apartment window. Dark, empty, waiting for me to come home to my silence. Somewhere across town, my family was probably opening presents now. The children would be in their pajamas, tearing through wrapping paper while the adults drank coffee and took pictures. Michael would be helping Tommy set up some complicated toy, the way I used to help Michael on Christmas mornings long ago. But I wouldn't be there to see it. I wouldn't be part of those memories, wouldn't be in those pictures, wouldn't exist in the story of this Christmas at all. I'd been erased as completely as if I'd never been there in the first place. The week between Christmas and New Year's passed like a fever dream. I'd wake up each morning thinking maybe Michael would call, maybe he'd realize what he'd done, maybe there would be some acknowledgement of how wrong this all was. But my phone stayed silent. I'd find myself drafting text messages I'd never send. I hope the children enjoyed their Christmas. Delete. Thank you for letting me know where I stand. Delete. I say it in my car watching your dinner party for 2 hours. Delete. I practice conversations in the mirror, in the shower, while making coffee in the morning. All the things I should have said, all the ways I could have handled that phone call better. Michael, I raised you better than this. Michael, your grandchildren deserve to know their grandfather. Michael, I won't be treated like a stranger by my own son. But these were conversations I'd never have, words that would stay trapped in my throat while my phone remained silent and my apartment grew smaller around me. By New Year's Eve, something had shifted inside me. Maybe it was anger finally breaking through the hurt. Maybe it was just exhaustion from carrying this pain alone. But I realized that if I didn't speak up for myself, no one else would. At 8 o'clock that night, I picked up my phone and called Michael's number. I didn't plan what I was going to say, didn't rehearse the conversation one more time. I just called. Sarah answered on the third ring. Hello? Her voice went cold the moment I identified myself. Hi, Sarah. It's Michael's father. Is he available? A pause. In the background, I could hear the television, children's voices, the sound of a normal family evening. Michael's busy with the kids right now, she said. but I could hear him laughing at something in the background. He wasn't busy. He was just being protected from having to talk to me. For the first time in months, I found my voice. "I need to talk to my son," I said, and there was something in my tone that must have surprised her, because the coldness wavered. "Hold on." I heard muffled conversation, Sarah telling Michael it was me, Michael's response that I couldn't quite make out, then footsteps, a door closing, and finally Michael's voice. "Hi, Dad." He sounded guilty, defensive, like a teenager who'd been caught breaking curfew. "Hello, Michael." Another pause. Neither of us seemed to know how to start this conversation. We should have had a week ago. "How was your Christmas?" he asked, and the question was so absurd, so tone-deaf, that I almost hung up. Instead, I took a breath and told him the truth. "I spent Christmas Eve sitting in my car across the street from your house, watching my family celebrate without me." The silence that followed was so long, I wondered if the call had dropped. "Dad, I didn't know you were there," I finished for him. "But would it have mattered if you did?" More silence. That told me everything I needed to know. "I watched Sarah's parents arrive with their arms full of presents," I continued, my voice growing stronger with each word. "I watched her sister's family run up to your door like they owned the place. I counted 11 people at your dinner table, Michael. 11 people at the gathering that would have been too stressful if your father had been there." "Dad, please, no." The word came out harder than I intended, but I didn't soften it. "I've been polite for too long. I've been understanding for too long. I've accepted being managed and scheduled and treated like a problem to be solved instead of a father to be loved." I could hear him breathing, but he didn't interrupt. "I understand that you have a new family now," I said. "I understand that you have new priorities, but that doesn't mean you get to erase your old family. You don't get to rewrite history." My voice was shaking now, but I kept going. "You don't get to pretend I wasn't there for every Little League game, every parent-teacher conference, every midnight fever and broken heart. You don't get to pretend I didn't work 3 jobs to keep us afloat after your mother left. You don't get to pretend I didn't sacrifice everything I had so you could have the life you wanted." My voice cracked on the last part, but I forced myself to continue. "I'm not asking you to choose between your wife and your father. Michael, I'm asking you to remember that your father exists." For the first time in this conversation, when Michael spoke, he sounded like the little boy I used to comfort after nightmares. "I'm sorry, Dad," he whispered, but sorry wasn't enough anymore. "Sorry doesn't give me back Christmas Eve," I told him. "Sorry doesn't undo the humiliation of being told I'm too stressful for my own family's celebration. Sorry doesn't heal the wound of being deemed unworthy of my own grandchildren's Christmas memories." "I never meant for you to feel—" "How did you think I would feel, Michael?" I asked. "When you called me 3 days before Christmas and uninvited me from dinner? When you told me I could drop off presents like a delivery man but couldn't stay to watch my grandchildren open them? How exactly did you think I would feel?" He had no answer for that. "I raised you to be better than this," I said quietly. "I raised you to understand that family doesn't abandon each other. I raised you to know that love isn't conditional on convenience." "You did," he said, and his voice broke a little. "You did raise me better than this." We sat in silence for a moment, both of us breathing hard like we'd been running. "What do you want me to do, Dad?" he asked finally. It was the first time in years that he'd asked what I wanted instead of telling me what would work best for everyone else. "I want you to remember who I am," I said. "I want you to remember that I'm not just some old man who shows up at family gatherings. I'm your father. I'm the man who held you when you cried for your mother. I'm the man who taught you to ride a bike and drive a car and be a decent human being." "I remember," he said softly. "Do you? Because lately I've felt like a stranger in your life, like someone you tolerate out of obligation rather than someone you love because I'm your dad. That's not how I feel about you. Then why am I sitting alone in my apartment on New Year's Eve while you celebrate with your real family?" The question hung in the air between us, heavy and painful and impossible to ignore. "I don't know," Michael admitted. "I honestly don't know how we got here." "We got here because you let Sarah decide who belongs in your family," I said. "We got here because you stopped fighting for me, stopped making space for me, stopped remembering that I matter too." "You're right," he said, and there was something different in his voice now, something that sounded like the son I used to know. You're absolutely right, and I don't know how to fix it. You fix it by remembering that respect isn't optional in a relationship, I told him. You fix it by treating me like your father instead of like a burden you inherited. I want to fix it, Dad. I really do. For the first time in months, Michael sounded like he meant it, but wanting to fix something and actually fixing it are two very different things. Then you need to decide who you want to be, I said. Do you want to be the kind of man who abandons his father because it's easier than standing up to his wife? Or do you want to be the kind of man who honors the people who sacrificed for him? I want to be better, he said quietly. Then be better, Michael. It's not too late to be better. When we hung up 5 minutes later, I felt something I hadn't felt in months. Hope. Not certainty, not confidence that everything would be magically fixed, but hope that maybe my son still remembered who he used to be. Maybe sorry wasn't enough, but it was a start. That night, after the phone call with Michael, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying our conversation, thinking of all the things I should have said, all the words that had stayed locked inside me for too long. At 2 a.m, I gave up on sleep and made coffee. I sat at my small kitchen table with a pad of paper and a pen, and I started writing the letter I knew I'd never send. Dear Michael, I began, then stopped. How do you put 18 years of single parenthood into words? How do you explain sacrifice to someone who's never had to make it? I started over. I need you to understand something, son. I need you to understand what it was like after your mother left. The words came slowly at first, then faster, like water breaking through a dam. I wrote about the morning I found Janet's note, about having to tell a 6-year-old that Mommy wasn't coming home. I wrote about the nights Michael cried himself to sleep, calling for her, while I stood outside his bedroom door, wondering how I was going to raise a child alone. I wrote about learning to braid hair from YouTube videos, about figuring out how to pack school lunches that other kids wouldn't make fun of, about staying up until midnight helping with homework I barely understood myself. I wrote about working 3 jobs and still coming home to find the electricity shut off, about eating peanut butter sandwiches for dinner so Michael could have real meals, about falling asleep at red lights because I'd been awake for 36 hours straight. The letter grew longer, 5 pages, then 10, then 15. I wrote about my own father, who died when I was 12, leaving my mother to raise 3 children alone. I wrote about the promise I'd made to myself that I'd never leave my son the way my dad had left me. Not by choice, anyway. I kept that promise, I wrote. I was there for every scraped knee, every bad dream, every heartbreak. I was there when you learned to drive, when you graduated high school, when you got accepted to college. I was there when you got married, when you had children of your own. I've always been there, Michael. Until now. I wrote about the loneliness that had become my constant companion, about going days without speaking to another human being, about watching game shows in the evening just to hear voices that weren't my own. I wrote about the grandchildren who barely knew me, who would grow up with vague memories of an old man who used to visit sometimes, who would hear whispered stories about the grandfather who wasn't quite good enough to be included. Tommy asked me once why I couldn't stay for dinner, I wrote. I told him Grandpa had to go home to feed his cat, even though I don't have a cat. I lied to my own grandson, rather than tell him the truth, that his father doesn't want me around. The anger came out in the letter. The frustration I'd been swallowing for months. I wrote about Michael's weakness, about how he'd let Sarah dictate who belonged in his family. I wrote about Sarah herself, about how she'd never given me a real chance, how she'd decided from the beginning that I didn't fit into the life she'd planned. I wrote about the Christmas Eve phone call, about sitting in that cold car for 2 hours, about watching my family celebrate without me, while I shivered outside like an unwanted stranger. I raised you better than this, I wrote. I raised you to understand loyalty, to honor the people who sacrificed for you, to stand up for what's right even when it's difficult. Where is that man now, Michael? Where is the son I raised? But I also wrote about fear. The fear that this was how my story would end, alone and forgotten by the people I loved most. The fear that I'd wasted my life raising a son who would abandon me when I needed him most. I'm 67 years old, I wrote. I have maybe 10 or 15 good years left, if I'm lucky. I don't want to spend them begging for scraps of attention from my own child. I don't want to spend them being grateful for the privilege of existing in your life. By 4 in the morning, the letter was 20 pages long. My hand ached from writing, and my coffee had gone cold hours ago. But I wasn't finished. I wrote about the dreams I'd deferred for. Him, the opportunities I'd turned down because single fathers with young children don't get second chances. I wrote about the woman I'd dated briefly when he was in high school, how I'd ended it because she wanted to move in together, and I was afraid it would disrupt his senior year. I wrote about all the Christmas mornings I'd made magical with money I didn't have, all the birthday parties I'd thrown in our tiny apartment, all the times I'd pretended everything was fine when I was scared out of my mind about how we were going to make it. I never regretted any of it, I wrote. Not the sacrifices, not the exhaustion, not the loneliness. I'd do it all again if I had to, because you were worth it. You were worth everything I gave up, everything I endured, everything I sacrificed. The sun was coming up when I finally stopped writing. 23 pages of everything I'd never been able to say, everything I'd kept locked inside while I tried to be the understanding father, the convenient father, the father who didn't cause problems. I folded the letter carefully, put it in an envelope, and wrote Michael's address on the front in my careful handwriting. Then I sat there looking at it, knowing I'd never send it. Some truths are too big for letters, too painful for words. Some truths can only be lived, endured, carried alone, until they either break you or make you stronger. I put the letter in my desk drawer, underneath some old bills and insurance papers. Maybe someday I'd read it again, remember this night when the pain was so fresh I could barely breathe through it. Or maybe I'd throw it away, let those words disappear like everything else from the life I used to have, when I still believed that being a good father was enough to guarantee being a wanted one. Either way, the letter had served its purpose. It had let me say all the things I couldn't say out loud, all the truths that were too heavy to carry alone. And maybe that was enough. Maybe that was all I could do with the love that had nowhere to go, the words that no one wanted to hear, the pain that no one else understood. Maybe writing them down was enough, even if no one would ever read them. Maybe it had to be. It's been exactly 1 year since that night in the car, and I'm sitting in my kitchen having coffee and reading the newspaper like it's any other morning. The apartment feels different now, not smaller, but more solid somehow, like a place I've chosen to be instead of a place I've ended up. I've learned to live with silence, not the heavy, oppressive silence of loneliness, but something closer to peace. I've learned the difference between being alone and being lonely, and most days now, I'm just alone. The phone rings at 9 a.m. sharp, and for just a moment, I'm back to that Christmas Eve phone call, bracing for another blow. But when I see Michael's name on the caller ID, something in my chest loosens instead of tightening. "Hi, Dad." His voice sounds different. Older, maybe. More careful. "Good morning, Michael." "Merry Christmas, Dad." "Merry Christmas to you too, son." We sit in silence for a moment, and it's not uncomfortable. It's just two people taking time to find the right words. "Dad," he says finally, "I know this might sound strange, but would you like to come over today, for dinner?" I set down my coffee cup and take a deep breath. A year ago, I would have said yes immediately, would have rushed over and pretended nothing had happened, grateful for any invitation back into my family's life. But I've learned something about my own worth in these 12 months of solitude. "What changed?" I ask. There's a long pause, and I can hear voices in the background. The children, Sarah, the sounds of Christmas morning happening around him while he tries to find words for this conversation. Emma asked where. "Grandpa was last Christmas," he says quietly. Sarah and I tried to explain, but we couldn't. We realized we didn't have a good answer. Emma, my granddaughter, now 7 years old. I picture her asking that innocent question, "Where was Grandpa last Christmas?" And my heart breaks a little more. "I've been thinking about what you said on New Year's," Michael continues, "about not rewriting history. You're right, Dad. I can't pretend you weren't there for everything." "No," I agree. "You can't." "I want you here," he says, and for the first time in over a year, his voice sounds like my son again. "We want you here." I want to say yes immediately, want to hang up and drive over there and pretend this past year never happened. But I've learned that wanting something and being ready for it are two different things. I need you to understand something, Michael, I tell him. I'm not asking for charity. I'm not asking to be tolerated out of guilt or obligation. If I come to your house today, it's because I belong there, not because you feel sorry for the lonely old man. You do belong here, Dad, he says, and there's something in his voice I haven't heard in years. Certainty. You've always belonged here. I'm sorry it took me so long to remember that. What about Sarah? I ask, because I need to know where I stand with her too. Another pause. Sarah knows she was wrong, he says. We both know we were wrong. I can't promise everything will be perfect right away, but I can promise we want to try. I look around my quiet apartment, at the small Christmas tree I bought for myself this year, at the peace I've built in this space. I could say no. I could tell Michael I need more time. That one phone call doesn't erase a year of pain. But Emma asked where Grandpa was last Christmas, and maybe, just maybe, that's more important than my hurt feelings. I'll be there at Twalio. Oh, I tell him. Really? The relief in his voice is so naked it almost breaks my heart. Dad, thank you. Thank you for giving us another chance. We'll see how it goes, I say, but I'm already mentally planning what to wear, wondering if those presents I bought last year and never gave are still in my closet. When I arrive at Michael's house 3 hours later, I park in the driveway instead of across the street. I walk up to the front door like I have every right to be there. Before I can knock, the door flies open and Emma launches herself at me, wrapping her arms around my waist like no time has passed at all. Grandpa, you're here. You're really here. Hi, sweetheart, I say, and my voice catches a little. I missed you. I missed you too. Mommy said you might come for Christmas dinner, and I said I hoped you would because Christmas isn't the same without Grandpa's. Over her head, I see Michael standing in the doorway, and for a moment he looks exactly like the little boy I used to lift onto my shoulders. Hi, Dad, he says quietly. Hello, son. We look at each other across all the months of silence, all the hurt feelings and careful distance, and I realize something important. He looks tired. Not physically tired, but emotionally exhausted, like he's been carrying something heavy for too long. Sarah appears behind him, and her smile is careful but genuine. Hello, she says. I'm glad you could come. It's not warm, not yet, but it's not cold either. It's a beginning. The dinner isn't perfect. There are awkward moments, conversations that start and stop, the careful politeness of people learning how to be family again. But I'm here, sitting at the table where I wasn't welcome a year ago, and that matters. Tommy shows me his new skateboard, explains the tricks he's learning with the serious intensity of an 8-year-old expert. Emma insists I sit next to her so she can tell me about her art class, about the picture she drew of our family that includes me standing next to her in crayon. I put you in all bakwanin. My pictures, Grandpa, she says matter-of-factly. Even when you weren't here, I put you in them. I have to excuse myself to the bathroom for a moment after that, just to collect myself. When we're clearing dishes, Michael follows me into the kitchen. Thank you for coming, he says quietly. I know it couldn't have been easy. No, I agree. It wasn't. I want you to know that things are going to be different, he says. No more asking permission to see your grandchildren. No more scheduled visits. You're their grandfather. You belong in their lives. And what about you? I ask. Do I belong in your life too? He stops drying the plate in his hands and looks at me directly. Yes, he says. You belong in my life too. I'm sorry it took me so long to remember that. We stand there in his kitchen, two men who used to know each other perfectly, learning how to be father and son again. I love you, Dad, Michael says, and it's been so long since I've heard those words that they hit me like a physical force. I love you too, son, I tell him. I always have, even when I didn't deserve it, he finishes for me, even then. As I drive home that evening, I realize something important. I survived being excluded from this family, which means I'm strong enough to be included on my own terms. I'm not the same man who sat in that cold car a year ago, grateful for any scrap of attention, any acknowledgement of my existence. I'm a man who knows his own worth now, a man who demands respect as well as love, A man who understands that relationships require effort from both sides, that forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting, that some wounds leave scars even after they heal. The dinner wasn't perfect. There are still conversations we need to have, still trust that needs to be rebuilt, still work to be done. But for the first time in over a year, I feel like I matter again. Like I belong somewhere, like being a father means something after all. And maybe, just maybe, that's the Christmas gift I needed most. Not perfection, not the erasure of all the pain from this past year, but the simple recognition that I deserve a place at my own family's table. It's a start. After everything we've been through, everything we've lost and found again, it's enough of a start.